In the last episode of Pinball, after being reunited, the party of strangers took to rest at a campsite amongst reserved territory. As Mick Strings slept beside the fire, Noelle Sélevy sought to discover the true parameters of her remnant's powers. Even with the help of Saigō Satogaeri, mastery seemed impossible. The two were not properly in sync. Byleth's concentration seemed elsewhere. With her own abilities, Saigō entered Noelle's mind to help her diagnose the problem, only to find Byleth had been suppressing the memories of her trauma, believing her to be too weak to handle the responsibility. Soon after, Saigō was forcibly removed from Noelle's mind, and the two were left alone, her body under physical threat now. Byleth ordered Noelle to accept her own actions or face death. She accepted, and memories of her own auto-enucleation flooded her mind. Self-inflicted blindness brought on by the horrors of understanding all that can be seen. Noelle accepted she had become stronger with the truth, and before waking, made a deal with Byleth in return for their full power. Noelle Sélevy surfaced from her mindscape to find that the party of strangers had been surrounded. Following the middle line, the stationary plate's wavelength, she could count the peaking signatures of life and distinguish their placements, their movements, and their weaknesses. She counted 14 from right to left, and they seemed to have only one incoming reinforcement. Not one of them was Cambion. Saigō, even without a view of the impending future, was more than capable enough to tackle 4 on her own. Her fierce whipping cuts struck the fear of God in her opponents. And while Noelle could not track her individual swipes, she could feel a new resonance inflict itself on the mortal sound one by one, like an illness. Saigō's remnant was taking a backseat, as though the enemy wore blinders. It did not matter. 4 became 3, and 3 became 2. Evidently, Mick had chosen the strongest foe for himself. Taller than he was, and able to match him blow for blow, like a seasoned boxer. He had a large mass strapped to his back. Must have been a sword. It weighed down his movements significantly, and still, the two were locked in an evenly paced fistfight. An audience of 2 gormless, dumbstruck soldiers watched on, unaware of their worldly responsibilities. Harun too left much of the action to their host alone, providing only the strength and determination required to persist. It was as though they saw it as dishonorable to just outright slaughter mortal men despite the threat they posed. Noelle stood. It appeared that she had been protected once again, for the closest life signature to her own was a man entirely and possibly eternally unconscious. Her rise, however, was considered a challenge, and another faceless figure began to step towards her. "Hey," it told her, "get back down on your belly." "Noelle," called Mick's voice, like the squawk of a distant bird. "1 step forward, 1 to your right. It's a hammer," he yelled. "Pick it up, will ya?" "Get back here and fight me, you baby," called his adversary, sending out 100 socks a minute. "Don't you dare," warned the nearest soldier. "If you pick that hammer up, I swear, I'll cut your goddamn hands off." He had a very loud voice, but he didn't move an inch when she kicked at the weapon to determine its proper location. A hammer felt very cerebral, very real, caused her to question their implied honor. Had she been born with a remnant that could, say, produce swords or yet laser beams, would she feel the same way as them? True to his word, the nearest soldier crouched in low and dashed towards Noelle, weapons free, as she went for the hammer. The moment that her fingers touched the steel bar, she reached out for the bottom line and pulled herself into the filter plate unharmed. As she suspected, the hammer itself followed her in, offering ample time to grasp it in both hands, dart away from where her foe would have landed, and return to the stationary plate with force. And there he was. The nearest soldier was exactly where she'd predicted him to be. Only a few seconds had passed while she'd been away. Though it was a fact that space remained consistent, time seemed to rely more on inertia. They'd cracked it. Together. Now her enemy was confused and still unaware of her inexplicable apparition. She could hearken back to what she'd learned with Byleth only yesterday in the filter plate. She grasped the middle line within her mind, and with all the mental strength she could muster, Noelle pulled herself in the direction of her enemy, weapons free. That was what she could do. Noelle Sélevy had total freedom of movement from resistance, rebellion against physics, and with the impossible momentum offered by this transcendental traversal, Noelle smacked the head of the hammer into her foe. She was a pinball, struck and shot up the lane at incredible speeds. She felt his heart cut out on impact. His music disappeared as his body continued onwards, landing just a few feet ahead of her. She'd been aiming for the head, but she managed to get him in the guts. Regardless, it was at least an answer to the hypothetical. Given that not a single member of the opposition had access to a remnant, it was clear to Noelle that they were up against the Hunters, likely from the citadel Saigō had targeted. Her plan, it seemed, had been foiled, and their campsite had been rumbled. Arriving now, heralded by enemy trumpets and announced by name, Vice Marshal Laika Rossi. Their reinforcements of one had arrived. Laika sauntered over to the group rather slowly, leaving both Saigō and Mick enough time to recognize her, flee from their respective fights, and join Noelle where she was standing. It was mutually and silently agreed that Noelle would likely not get another lucky break like that again. Her abilities, as malleable as they were not suited to flailing blindly with a hammer. It didn't matter. She had her own plans now, and they did not involve winning the fight. The Vice Marshal commanded such attentiveness from the Hunters that the party of strangers could have snuck away if they were quick enough about it. Mick's foe, the tall one with the unused hunk of steel strapped to his back, went as quick as he could to his master, like an obedient dog wishing to be scratched behind the ears. As they spoke in inaudible tones, the ambience surrounding the Hunters seemed to change, as though they themselves were afraid of Laika. Noelle didn't recognize her at all. She seemed to walk with a cane, judging by the sound of her footsteps, but she didn't put any of her weight onto it, so it wasn't a necessity. There seemed to be something strange about her life signature. The noises that only she made seemed amplified, but in an unrecognizable way. It was something on her person, she thought. As the tension ramped up, Mick had some words of advice. He leaned over to Noelle and whispered, "Keep your distance, love. That's the space dog. She's gonna lead that whole army one day, and for good reason." Saigō added, "Watch out for her ribbons. They're weapons. I've seen it all before. Believe it or not, we'll be safe, as long as we keep at least 2.5 meters between us." Laika approached them, so the group took a step back. Laika returned the favor, taking 3 steps. The group, in a shirk of rebellion, retreated 4 steps backwards. This, it would seem, could go on all day, but Laika had little time to play around. "Excuse me," she spoke through cupped hands, the makeshift megaphone. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Put your hands up and approach slowly. Nobody else needs to die here today." "I dunno," said Mick. "Kinda fishy, huh?" "Oh, are you asking me?" said Noelle. "Don't worry, I believe in you. Nothing you can't do, huh?" "Don't encourage him," Saigō told her. "I'm thinking about it." "Really?" Mick cupped his hands together back at Laika and shouted, "You gonna kill us?" "Time's up. I need to speak to the actual marshal before we're executed," said Saigō. "I'm willing to bargain with him." Laika didn't have the chance to yell back at them. It was her phone. It was ringing. Noelle could hear it from where she was standing. About 3 meters hung between them, far enough to obscure the caller's voice, but not enough to hide Laika's own reports back to her number 2. It was the Ace of Cups on the line. She had arrived at the waypoint. Citadel Othris is what they called it. She was, verbatim, pretty miffed that Laika and Siegfried were both out of the building, and she expected them to return post-haste. "I shall," said Leica down the phone, "and with me I shall bring our charming sinful friends." Then the dialogue paused. Noelle felt Mick tense up, like he'd gotten some kind of shiver, and Saigō gripped her sword. The King of Things tore another strip of cloth from his uniform, obscuring the last few words of their conversation before Leica cut the call, stowed her cell, and began addressing the party again with cupped hands. "I'm sorry about this, but please disregard my prior statement," she told them. "The Mother has revoked our no-kill order. Please be prepared. We are authorized to use lethal force in the event that..." Leica's sentence was cut short by her second-in-command, who launched himself from her side like a shuttle re-entering the atmosphere. She called after him, even called his name. "Siegfried," she shouted, but it fell on deaf ears. In one precise motion, Siegfried pulled the oversized slab of metal from his back and swung with all the force of a small army. Thunderous cracking followed by an unbraceable impact, as though he'd carved a new canyon from the Tasmanian landscape. To Noelle, Mick's strings ceased to exist. His sound vanished, and she could no longer sense the wings of Harun. Speechless, for once, and hollow now, Mick fell in two parts. There was little time to form a goodbye or a regret. Just as quick as he'd closed the distance, Siegfried readied himself for a second strike. He recomposed and evened out the impossible weight of his weapon, shaking Mick's blood from the blade of it. It was without thinking that Noelle grabbed Saigō by the wrist and pulled the both of them into the filter plate. It wasn't something that she knew she could do, but her earlier trick with the warhammer gave her an inkling. As long as they were here, they would remain unharmed. Siegfried seemed inhuman, despite his mortality. His strength and his speed had no parallel in their Legion of Two now. Mick had the confidence and, well, given his penchant for stories, he had the experience. And Leica's right-hand man had just been toying with him. Saigō seemed in a state of shock, be it her sudden loss or the instantaneous change in location. "Careful," Noelle warned her. "Try not to breathe the air here." It was all that she could manage, given the tension. She didn't know Mick very well. After all, they'd only known each other for approximately 22 hours, give or take. But Saigō, she'd spent her entire career with him, and she'd chosen him, of all people, to rebel with her, to help protect the baby, Nyoro, from the fiends that had done this to them. "He will be missed," she said, toying with something in her hands. The intonation in her voice had not changed. She kept her truest words to herself. Saigō bent at the knees, spread some of the filter's sand with her fingers, and buried the object amongst the imagined fibers. "Believe it or not, I have heard that remnants reform in the filter plate after our death." "I believe it," said Noelle. "I want to believe that Harun might find this strip of cloth that I bury here and remember him fondly as we will," she said, mostly to herself. "God rest the King of Things." Noelle nodded and gave her a moment. She had not taken Saigō to be a religious person, though perhaps her own remnant had gone out of its way to explain the absolute fact of the aforementioned afterlife. While Byleth's woes of disappointment rang through her mind, it was a little comforting to know that he had not just been erased. At least there was something else, regardless of the form it took, for he had been born into a harsh existence against his own will. It would make what needed to happen much easier. It felt a little too soon to be planning their next move, but they could not just wait in the darkness. Time, on the stationary plate, ticked on too fast above to hold a whole funeral service, and the opportune placement of the Ace of Cups would not last them forever. It was a truth that Saigō Satogaeri could not deny, and she had no problem forming a new plan in the depths of the filter plate. In fact, Saigō knew exactly what needed to be done, and she could do it all with Noelle's help. Before their operation began, however, Noelle had one simple question. She wished to know what the filter looked like. She wished for Saigō to describe it to her. It was as though they were standing along the seabed. Sand and silt shifted at their feet as though it was weightless in motion. but stayed flat to the floor if ignored. It was pitch black. Frankly, there was no other phrase for it. The filter plate was in this state of constant, sullen gloaming, and yet Saigō's eyes could see clear as day far, far off into the horizon from where the two of them stood. Light did not shine in the filter, but the landscape was a discernibly different shade of blue from the horizon. Above them, if Saigō looked upwards, there was a thin ring of white, somewhat emulating a dying sun. Though it appeared to be impossibly out of reach, she could see smoke lifting from it. The man-made overcame the few instances of the natural in the distance ahead. Laying stone monoliths, upside-down glass towers nearing tipping point, and there was an old-style motorcar buried hood deep in the dirt. Here and there were ash-white coral reefs bursting out into the nothingness, leading further into the empty, and there was some significant evidence of unearthly fauna, like footprints and bite marks. "It goes on forever like that," said Saigō. Noelle thought it sounded quite peaceful. Saigō's plan of action was hardly discussed, and it was certainly not up for debate. On the bright side, it was none too complex. It required only one moving part, and that was Saigō herself. Noelle, it was decided, would satchel herself and hang off her back as the soldier displayed her incredible leg strength by flat out running through the Tasmanian bush for as long as she physically could, or, God forbid, until she spotted a cabal of hunters, at which point she would yell the phrase, "Down!" and they would dip from plate to plate. Saigō could pivot, re-coordinate, and start running in another direction before shouting up to return to the real world. Nigh unstoppable, the pair traversed the plains of existence as though they were part of a fast-track highway, totally avoiding the spaghetti junction of the forest reserve, a direct route to their destination. Saigō didn't need to tell Noelle where they were going, she could quite easily tell herself. They were coming up on hundreds, no, thousands of life signatures. Citadel Othris. It seemed that both of them had one last trick up their sleeve. Saigō stopped running. All of a sudden, it became clear, quite quickly, that they were almost intentionally surrounded by all the hunters could throw at them. Somewhere, in the scaled tower that stood before them, was the Ace of Cups, pacing, preparing. How would Saigō Satogaeri recover the infant? Would Ace come down to face them herself? From amongst the innumerable unnamed mortal soldiers, there was an anxious chatter and under-breath ordering. Not one of them moved, nor did they choose to address their unarmed foes, perhaps out of fear. "Hunters of Citadel Othris, stand down," Saigō demanded, with all the authority she still possessed, nearly 2 years after defecting. At least 6 of the soldiers made moves to lower their weapons before being briefly reprimanded and reminded of their orders. Saigō's fist shot up in the air, commanding the attention of every eye in the perimeter. "By authority of the Father, I invoke my right to demand an audience with Grand Marshal Valentine. Verification, the gluttony of the sinful project." A beat passed, and her demands seemed to have some kind of effect on them. The hunters began murmuring again, hastily passing facts back and forth between their ranks and their folds until finally there came an answer from a voice that could silence the crowd. "The Grand Marshal is off island," said the voice. "He won't be back for 3 weeks." "Fuck me," said Noelle. "That's unexpected." "You sound just like Mick," said Saigō. "I'll wait for the Vice Marshal then. As far as I'm aware, my rank still holds, does it not?" A brief murmur came from the crowd, and all seemed to be in some kind of mutual agreement that attacking the two of them was just about the worst thing that they could do. Noelle didn't quite agree. In fact, she knew that they were heavily outnumbered, and escape to the filter plate was their only option other than facing death. Still, it was all the same to the hunters, as if an army was staring right back at them. "Bring her here, alone. Believe me, if I see that mangy dog of hers, I won't hesitate to take his head." You have been listening to Pinball, Measure 4, Subito, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2021 by the Sleepybones Detective Agency. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you'd like to support the show, please visit us at patreon.com/sbda.